When people talk about America's rise, they usually point to big ideas, freedom, ambition, innovation. But ideas don't move on their own. In the early 19th century, America was rich in land and poor in connection. Towns lived like islands. Markets were local, fragile, and slow. Then something changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. Steel rails began creeping across the land. At first, they looked like just another tool. No one called them revolutionary. And yet, quietly, they started doing something no speech or law ever had. They compressed distance. This video isn't about trains. It's about how shrinking distance reshaped power, money, and the rhythm of daily life. Because once distance stopped being a limit, everything else followed. Before railroads, moving goods was painfully slow. A farmer could grow surplus, but selling it far away was often impossible. Roads were unreliable. Rivers helped, but only where nature allowed. Distance decided who could trade and who couldn't. Wealth stayed trapped. Railroads broke this logic. They didn't just make transport faster. They made markets predictable. Suddenly, producers could plan. Merchants could expand. Risk became calculable. This is where modern economics truly begins, not in theory, but in logistics. When movement becomes reliable, trust follows. And where trust exists, markets explode. With predictability came scale. Businesses that once served a town could now serve a region. Regions became nations. Railroads turned America into a single economic body. A shock in one place rippled everywhere. This was new and dangerous. Growth accelerated, but so did dependency. The economy was no longer a collection of local systems. It was one machine, and machines demand coordination. As railroads expanded, something subtle but profound happened. Time itself became an economic resource. Before trains, time was local. Noon meant when the sun stood overhead, and every town lived by its own clock. But trains couldn't function in a world where time disagreed every few miles. Schedules demanded obedience. So railroads imposed order. Standardized time zones were not created by philosophers or governments, but by railway companies trying to avoid collisions. Once time was unified, businesses synchronized. Factories aligned shifts. Markets opened and closed together. The economy began to pulse to a shared rhythm. Time stopped being something you experienced and became something you managed. Productivity wasn't just about effort anymore. It was about timing. This invisible shift quietly disciplined the entire nation. America learned to live by the clock, and the clock answered to the rails. Railroads didn't just move goods, they reorganized labor. To keep trains running, companies needed strict hierarchies, clear commands, and disciplined workers. This structure spread outward. Factories copied it. Offices adopted it. Even modern management language traces back to railroads. Efficiency, oversight, supervision, these weren't abstract ideas. They were survival tools. Work stopped being seasonal and became continuous. The modern workday wasn't invented in a classroom. It was forged along the tracks. For millions, life began to revolve around shifts, timetables, and wages tied to hours instead of outcomes. The economy didn't just grow, it hardened. And once labor adapted to the rails, it could adapt to anything. Then came capital. Railroads were too big for traditional funding. They demanded unprecedented investment. To build them, America invented new financial instruments, stocks, bonds, large-scale speculation. Ordinary citizens became investors. Risk spread across society. Wall Street didn't rise independently. It rose because railroads needed money. Finance and infrastructure fused. This changed power forever. Whoever controlled the rails controlled access to markets, resources, and growth. Railroads weren't just businesses. They were economic gatekeepers. And for the first time, private companies held influence once reserved for governments. As railroads tightened their grip, geography stopped being neutral. Before the rails, towns emerged organically, near rivers, crossroads, fertile land. After the rails, survival depended on one brutal question: are we on the line? A station could turn empty land into a booming city overnight. A rerouted track could kill a town without firing a shot. Railroads didn't just follow economic demand, they created it. Entire regions rose or collapsed based on corporate decisions made in distant offices. This was a new kind of power, quiet, administrative, almost invisible. No armies, no laws. Just steel and schedules. America's economic map was redrawn, not by voters, but by engineers and executives. And once geography became negotiable, nothing felt permanent anymore. With this power came abuse. Railroad monopolies began charging discriminatory rates, favoring some businesses while crushing others. Farmers paid more than corporations. Small producers were squeezed out. Anger spread across the countryside. This wasn't abstract economics anymore. It was survival. Railroads had become too big to ignore and too powerful to escape. For the first time, Americans faced a terrifying realization: private infrastructure could dominate public life. This tension gave birth to regulation, antitrust laws, and the modern idea that markets sometimes need limits. The fight wasn't against trains, it was against unchecked scale. Government intervention followed, not out of ideology, but necessity. Railroads forced the state to grow smarter, stronger, and more organized. Regulation wasn't an enemy of capitalism. It was capitalism adapting to its own success. The modern American state didn't emerge in opposition to markets. It emerged to manage them. And railroads were the reason. They exposed what happens when speed, scale, and profit outpace control. America learned a hard lesson. Infrastructure builds economies, but it also reshapes power. And power, once concentrated, never stays quiet for long. By now, railroads had taught Americans a new rhythm. Life wasn't dictated by sunrise and seasons anymore. It was dictated by schedules, departures, arrivals. Children of farmers grew up measuring their day in shifts and train whistles. Merchants planned inventory around arrivals from hundreds of miles away. The economy no longer slept. It moved continuously. Consumption became predictable. Production became relentless. The simplest thing, a loaf of bread or a piece of coal, now depended on a chain of logistics stretching across states. Railroads weren't just tracks in the soil. They were the veins through which the new nation's lifeblood flowed. And once you live by a timetable, you begin to think in terms of efficiency, deadlines, and expansion. Railroads didn't just carry goods, they carried a new mindset. Railroads also reshaped where people lived. Cities grew around stations. Neighborhoods emerged because a train stopped there. Land values skyrocketed. Some towns boomed overnight. Others died silently when bypassed. America's population distribution was no longer random. It followed steel. This meant opportunity wasn't evenly spread. Some could participate in the new economy. Others were left behind. And yet, the railroads were neutral in intent. They were indifferent to morality. They obeyed efficiency. And in doing so, they created winners, losers, and a new kind of social hierarchy dictated by access to connection. The line between survival and failure became a matter of geography, choice, and timing. And the economy itself began to think bigger. Businesses could plan months ahead, anticipating shipments and consumer demand from across states. Farmers, once bound by local markets, could now sell grain to distant cities. Factories synchronized production with raw materials delivered from far away. Innovation accelerated because information traveled faster, too. The country was no longer a collection of isolated pockets. It had become a single, humming organism, and railroads were its nervous system. Every decision, every strategy, every expansion now considered the reach and speed of steel lines. The smallest miscalculation could ripple across the nation. The stakes of economic planning had never been higher. Speed also changed perception. Distance no longer limited ambition. A young entrepreneur in Chicago could dream of markets in New York or Boston. Ideas traveled along with goods, shaping culture, commerce, and politics. Newspapers could be printed in one city and read hundreds of miles away the same day. Railroads shrank America, making it smaller, faster, and more interconnected than anyone had imagined. And with that, the nation's imagination expanded. People stopped thinking locally. They began to think nationally, sometimes globally. Steel rails weren't just infrastructure. They were pipelines of possibility, carrying not only products but dreams, strategies, and new ways of seeing the world. Life along the rails changed in ways most people didn't notice at first. Farmers woke earlier to meet the train. Merchants counted on arrivals, not weather. Children's schedules shifted, schools adjusted to market timetables. Even holidays bent to departures and freight shipments. Routine itself became synchronized with steel. Families tracked when coal arrived to heat the house, when flour reached the store, when letters would come from distant relatives. The rhythm of life was no longer dictated by nature, but by infrastructure. And over time, this shift taught an entire generation to value speed, predictability, and connectivity above all else. The rails weren't just tracks, they were a new metronome for society. Commerce exploded. Small-town markets became regional hubs. Grain, coal, and manufactured goods could be shipped across hundreds of miles in days rather than weeks. Prices stabilized, supply chains became predictable, and risk could be calculated. Entrepreneurs who understood the network thrived. Those who ignored it vanished. Railroads created winners and losers with brutal efficiency. But this was more than economics. It reshaped social mobility. A farmer could become a merchant. A clerk could become an investor. Opportunity was now tied to connectivity. And nowhere else in the world had a single infrastructure so profoundly altered society's potential. And yet, this progress carried tension. Communities that had thrived for generations could collapse if bypassed by a new line. Labor disputes emerged as schedules demanded more discipline. Wealth concentrated in the hands of a few railroad magnates. Economic power was no longer a side effect of effort. It was centralized, scalable, and enforced by steel and schedules. America was becoming a machine, humming with productivity, efficiency, and order. And the rails were the engine. People had to learn to navigate not only markets, but also the invisible currents of infrastructure, timing, and corporate influence. Those who did thrived. Those who didn't were left behind. Growth, opportunity, and progress had a price, and it was measured in connection. Railroads connected more than goods. They connected minds. Ideas, news, and innovations traveled along the rails as quickly as coal or wheat. Newspapers could reach distant towns in days. Inventors could learn about breakthroughs hundreds of miles away. Political movements could mobilize nationally. The country was no longer a collection of isolated communities. It was a shared stage. Steel rails created a national consciousness. People began thinking about the country as a whole, not just their town or county. This shift changed elections, debates, and even culture. Railroads carried not only commerce, but also the collective imagination of a nation awakening to its own potential. Finance followed the rails. Building railroads required unprecedented amounts of capital, far beyond what small towns or local banks could provide. To fund construction, investors pooled resources in new ways: stocks, bonds, large-scale speculation. Ordinary citizens became part of national projects. Money moved faster than ever before. Wall Street and small-town financiers alike learned to think in terms of networks, leverage, and scale. Railroads didn't just carry goods. They carried wealth, concentrated power, and the seeds of modern finance. This transformation created enormous opportunity, but also immense risk. Booms and busts now traveled the rails as predictably as coal or timber, touching every part of the nation. Politics also bent to the steel. Railroads influenced legislation, regulations, and power balances. Local governments learned quickly that supporting or opposing the railroads could make or break their cities. National policies were shaped by lobbyists and railroad magnates. Infrastructure dictated influence. Elections were affected not only by voters' opinions, but also by which towns had access to the rails. A state with multiple lines prospered, one left behind stagnated. Democracy now interacted with infrastructure. In a new way, roads and rails dictated opportunity and political weight. Steel had become a silent politician, shaping the nation without ever speaking. Culture, too, changed with the rails. People could travel farther for work, leisure, or migration. Music, fashion, and ideas spread quickly. Communities that once seemed isolated shared festivals, news, and innovations. The nation began to feel smaller, interconnected, alive. Railroads weren't just iron and timber, they were arteries of culture. The American imagination expanded as people moved faster, interacted more, and envisioned possibilities beyond their hometowns. The rhythm of the trains became the rhythm of modern life, a constant reminder that distance was conquerable and potential was limitless. In this way, steel shaped not only economy and politics, but identity itself. Railroads changed labor in ways no one expected. Seasonal work became year-round. Factories aligned shifts with train arrivals. Workers' lives were no longer dictated by nature, but by steel. The morning whistle replaced rooster crowing. Schedules replaced intuition. Entire communities reorganized around timetables. Labor disputes intensified as the pace of life accelerated. Jobs demanded punctuality, discipline, and mobility. People could no longer rely solely on tradition. They had to adapt. The rhythm of the rails dictated when and how work happened. In subtle, relentless ways, railroads transformed the human experience itself. Life had become a system, and the steel veins running across the continent set its pulse. Small towns either thrived or faded based on their connection to the rails. A station could turn a sleepy village into a commercial hub overnight. Land speculation followed. Merchants who understood the network prospered. Those who ignored it disappeared. Wealth concentrated near tracks. Opportunity became geographic. Entire generations' fortunes rose or fell depending on a line of steel. And yet, railroads themselves were indifferent. They were tools of progress, blind to morality or fairness. Communities learned quickly, adapt to the network or vanish. The railroads did not create inequality, they revealed it. Distance no longer measured effort, but access. Survival was determined by proximity to connection. Consumer habits transformed. Goods that once traveled slowly became available in weeks instead of months. Fresh produce, manufactured clothing, and coal reached towns far from their origin. Markets expanded. Prices stabilized. Predictability allowed families to plan purchases and businesses to plan production. Consumption became structured. The modern consumer economy was born. Railroads didn't just carry products. They carried the expectations and habits of a nation. People learned to anticipate, to rely on speed, and to trust that distance no longer limited access. Life, commerce, and expectation all synchronized with steel and steam. Railroads also changed migration. People could seek work in distant cities. Immigrants moved faster. Industries found labor more easily, and talent flowed where it was needed. Families that once were bound to one village or town now spread across states. Ideas and culture traveled with them. Communities became more diverse, more connected. The movement of people mirrored the movement of goods. And just as commerce depended on predictable schedules, so too did life and opportunity. The nation's population became a network, living along the rails, connected by steel and steam. America was no longer scattered, it was interlinked. Finally, the scale of ambition grew. Businesses no longer thought locally, they planned nationally. Railroads made expansion conceivable. A company in Ohio could serve New England. Production, distribution, and finance intertwined. The economy was no longer a patchwork of isolated towns. It was a web, pulsing with speed and efficiency. Railroads taught the country to dream bigger, act faster, and measure success in distance covered and goods moved. They were the arteries of ambition, and the nation's growth would follow wherever the steel flowed. In a very real sense, railroads didn't just build America's economy, they built its imagination. By the late 19th century, the rails were more than transportation, they were symbols of progress. Towns, cities, and industries owed their growth to the steel arteries cutting across the continent. People no longer saw the nation as distant and vast. The railroad made it intimate and reachable. Investors, workers, and families all measured opportunity by proximity to the line. Railroads created not only wealth, but also expectation. Every child could imagine a life beyond the farm. Every merchant could dream of a market hundreds of miles away. Steel had reshaped possibility itself, teaching the nation that ambition, like a train, could move faster and farther than ever before. Technology and innovation followed the rails. Telegraphs ran alongside tracks, enabling instant communication. Ideas, blueprints, and strategies could be shared across states in hours instead of weeks. Scientific discoveries traveled faster. Entrepreneurs could coordinate production and sales like never before. Railroads became a conduit for modernity, merging infrastructure with intellect. In essence, the tracks carried not just physical goods, but knowledge and culture. They shrank distances, accelerated learning, and forced society to rethink what was achievable. The steel rails were lessons in speed, scale, and coordination, shaping the way America imagined its own potential. The railroad's legacy went beyond economics. They reshaped society, culture, and expectations. Families moved, towns emerged or vanished, work schedules synchronized, and communities became interconnected. Railroads taught Americans to value time, efficiency, and coordination. They created patterns of migration, commerce, and communication that lasted generations. Even after the steam engines faded, the habits, institutions, and mindset they instilled remained. America's identity as a nation capable of organizing, innovating, and expanding was inseparable from the iron rails that stitched it together. Steel had become a teacher, and the lessons endured long after the last whistle blew. And finally, the imagination of America was fueled. Railroads showed that ambition could transcend distance, that coordination could multiply impact, that innovation could travel faster than obstacles. Young Americans saw opportunities far from home. Entrepreneurs envisioned new markets, and the nation learned to dream at scale. Steel and steam were more than tools. They were catalysts for possibility. Every track laid became a symbol: reach farther, act faster, imagine bigger. The country's economic and cultural heartbeat was measured in miles of track and trains in motion. Railroads didn't just build America. They taught it to believe in its own potential. In the end, America's economy, society, and culture were forever intertwined with its railroads. Steel rails dictated movement, opportunity, and imagination. They carried goods, people, ideas, and ambition across a continent. The lessons of speed, scale, coordination, and vision reshaped generations. Railroads were more than infrastructure. They were the framework on which modern America was built. And long after the last train whistle faded into history, the rhythm, discipline, and imagination instilled by those rails continued to shape the nation. In every city, factory, and market, the echoes of the rails could still be felt, whispering the story of how steel built an economy, a society, and a dream.